Thank you, Alice, for the invitation and giving us the opportunity to speak about the work of Caruso in Hamburg. In this presentation, I will focus on two recently completed buildings by our office, but before that, introduce a general approach, or let's say interest, the office has in working within the urban fabric of Hamburg's city center. In Hamburg, there's a real thinking about the form of the city, careful urban planning, and a certain approach on how to preserve the continuity of the city structure and enhance public space. Apart from a couple of exceptions, the city of Hamburg decided not to push the boundaries of development further on the periphery. Instead, it envisions to grow within this existing city. Within this unusual situation where Hamburg is growing inwardly and existing inner city locations are being densified, we as an office seek to find an interesting balance and the right judgment between conservation and renewal with our projects. This map shows the location of two completed buildings right in the center of the city and a few other projects that the office has been working on recently. All emerge from an interesting and challenging balance between a carefully organized democratic planning process and the private interests of financially driven development. For example, in the case of our design for a new building on the Nikolai Fleet, the existing situation along Große Burster is being repaired to re-establish the permeability and lack of public space, which was lost as a consequence of traffic planning in the 1960s and 1970s. The areas that can be activated within the existing building stock without pushing the density issue beyond its limits lies at the heart of Hamburg's urban planning today. In these projects, we engage with the culture of the place as well as the specifics of the site. This is not a conservative position, but redeveloping a site or a building in an ideal world embodies the potential to bring together, or let's say, reassemble a collection of different urban realities, which as a condition today exists in many European cities. Our competition entry for the extension of the Globushof, which is located within the same urban block as the Große Burster, aims to find the right balance between inner city densification and a moderate building height. Another important aspect of continuing to build the city that is not about rebuilding the existing, but about developing it further, adding to it seen from the eyes of pedestrians. Hamburg is made up of many uniform streets, but also individual places and diverse neighborhoods. So to avoid monostructural parts in the city, enhance the quality of life, and return the public life in the city, a building and lively facade can contribute to and mediate between the diverse cultural layers of a place. From an environmental perspective, the facade that we see here of load-bearing local stone would reduce the embodied carbon of the shell and the internal building structure, as the stone piers are structural themselves and would replace the internal facade columns that are usually required to hold the slabs. Last year, we also worked on a feasibility study to transform the upper floors for the Kontorhaus Barkhof, situated on the Mönckebergstraße, which is one of the main shopping streets in the inner city of Hamburg. Built in 1910 by Franz Bach, the architect and developer was responsible for various other early versions of the Kontorhaus topology, all built about 10 to 15 years before the more well-known Chile-House and Sprinkenhof by Fritz Höger. Based on a challenging task here to reconfigure basically the plan of the top two floors to create a certain flexibility that can accommodate both offices and housing, this idea will hopefully become an exemplary project for buildings of the same type in Hamburg. Bringing housing back into the center of the city is a main objective of Hamburg City Council for the near future. At the same time, it is important to refurbish these existing structures, and in the case of the Barkhof, also change the design of the roof with the addition of new dormers and gables to reinstate the importance of this magnificent building, which today still plays an important role in the history of Hamburg at the beginning of the 20th century. This mixed-use building on the northeast corner of Hafen City is a project that is currently on hold, but was won in a competition in 2018. The new building makes a distinctive face to the Lose Park, which is an already established park by Vogt landscape architects. The building appears as a strong figure beside the river to the north, the large structures of the Oberhafenbrücke, and the railway towards the east. The solidity, vertical proportion, and sculptural quality of the green terracotta facade and the organization of the building around a network of 3 interconnected courtyards makes a reference to the large Kontorhäuser from the 1920s, which have a strong influence on the urban scale of the city today. The flexible organization of the block itself will enable a good mixed-use program in which the use is interchangeable in the future. On this historic map from 1791, we can see the extent of the city before its major remodeling in the 19th century, which was caused by the Great Fire of Hamburg in 1842, which then heavily altered the urban fabric of the inner city. But more importantly, we can see here that water is Hamburg's defining geographical feature, built on the junction of 3 rivers, the Elbe to the south, the Alster flowing north to south through the center of town, and the Bille to the east. It is a city of canals and bridges. 2 of the projects that I will talk about in more detail now are located within the former city walls, and their morphology within the city, even today, is defined by the surrounding bridges and canals. The Goetzpalais, which is a project that the office started working on in 2017, is a conversion of an existing building that forms part of the Stadthöfe, a versatile ensemble of buildings with a new mix of retail, hotel, offices, and some residential. Quantum are the developer of the whole complex, and we led the design to the planning stage and worked further on the detailed design for the Grade 1 listed building. Construction finished in 2021, and the project was delivered by local architects HN Architekten. The ensemble consists of 8 buildings grouped around 6 inner courtyards that span along the Bleichenfleet. It is located on the Neuer Wall in Neustadt, which is a busy shopping district today. The central street is about 600 meters long and stretches from Jungfernstieg on the Lake Binnenalster to Stadthausbrücke on its southern end. Left and right, the building's back sides are flanked by the Bleichenfleet and the Alster River. After its overall transformation, the Stadthöfe form a new conglomerate of historic buildings in which a network of public spaces has been reinstated. The history of the Goetzpalais on the Neuer Wall goes back to the 18th century and is an important building in the history of the city. It was the first building on the newly created central street within the 18th century city extension. The original building, seen on the left-hand side of this slide, was constructed as a grand house in 1710 by Johann Nicholas Kuhn and built on the city's former fortifications. The top image here shows the original facade design, and the bottom image gives an impression of the original passageway that used to connect to the courtyard behind the main facade. The building later functioned as a town hall during Napoleon's occupation, and later on became the headquarters of the police. Whereas the surrounding buildings witnessed a lot of change over the years, this magnificent Baroque facade of the Goetzpalais remained typologically a distinguished stranger, as Fritz Schumacher put it when he was the Stadtbaumeister at the beginning of the 20th century. During a bombing raid at the end of July 1943, large parts of the building ensemble were destroyed, including the Goetzpalais as seen on the left-hand side image. The remaining facade was restored in the 1950s, and the collapsed parts of the building were replaced with a new office building. 7 lower office floors were constructed by Carl Friedrich Fischer behind the 3-story historic backdrop. On the left of this slide, you can see the back facade of the new office building, which completely blocked off the passageway that used to connect to the courtyards behind, and which from then onwards remained closed basically to the public. During reconstruction in the 50s, the original shape and volume of the roof was also rebuilt, but much lower and flatter, as seen here on the right-hand side image. This completely robbed the building of its original character. This ground floor plan shows a proposed master plan as curated by David Chipperfield Architects. The Goetz Palais, highlighted in yellow here, has a key role within the southern end of the complex. The building acts as the south entrance to the network of courtyards of the Stadthof. The courtyards, which are connected to each other with passageways from the Palaishof to the Stadthof and Treppenhof on the north, are occupied by selected shops and restaurants and form a new public attraction today. Various architects worked on the revitalization of the historic buildings, and each courtyard was given an individual character. At the start of the project, it became evident early on that the existing 50s office building was not able to absorb the needs of the overall development. At the same time, the existing building stock was in quite a poor condition and not able to meet current regulations, especially fire regulations and modern standards. After many discussions with Jörn Walter, who was the Oberbaudirektor, so the city architect at the time, and negotiations with the Heritage Department, the so-called Denkmalamt in German, it was decided to partially demolish the existing building stock. In summary, the proposal removes the 1950s building behind the historic facade and makes a new 5-story building with suitable floor-to-ceiling heights for retail and offices. The foundations of the historic building, or let's say historic facade, needed to be reinforced to guarantee its stability, which would not have been possible by keeping the 50s extension. During demolition, remains of the original columns and archways of the ground floor were discovered, as seen on the right-hand side image, some of which were restored and incorporated in the new scheme. On the ground floor, the project opens up the historic carriageway from the Neuer Wall to the courtyard behind, here in the center of the plan, which in the 1950s was blocked off by the office, at the time existing office building. Where some of the existing masonry walls could structurally be integrated, a grid of new columns holds the office floors above, with 2 new circulation cores at either side of the building, placed in the same position as the original stairs. Towards the back, a new thin layer of shop-front windows undulates between the columns and creates a more transparent ground floor within the passage. The language of the new columns, painted in a dark color and light coffered ceiling, comes from an interpretation of the original Baroque architecture. A new pattern floor, benches along the walls, and 6 clusters of lighting globes create a more intimate and atmospheric space that invites visitors to linger. This perspective shows the view looking from the street entrance to the Palaishof at the back. In section, the original height and bulk of the gabled roof to the front is reintroduced. Towards the courtyard, the facade steps back on the top floor to create an accessible terrace for the offices. This helps to form a more coherent courtyard space as the new parapet of the 4th floor merges with the existing cornice of the surrounding buildings. The composition of the back facade, with locally manufactured clinker piers and light precast horizontals, follows the rhythm of the internal office grid, and most importantly, creates a relation to the existing courtyard facades to make a new whole. The beige or almost white color of the concrete elements refers to the color of the limestone of the existing front facade. On the ground floor, large bay windows create a visual connection between the indoor spaces and the public yard. The 1st floor has a projecting railing, which emphasizes the role of the 1st floor as a piano nobile. The new roof structure of the listed building refers to the character of the Baroque building as it existed up until the war. The proportion and volume of the new roof feels more appropriate in relation to the main body of the building. A new set of dormers within the pitched roof, clad in dark metal, brings light deep into the attic space and also helps to re-establish the liveliness of the front elevation and historic significance of the Goetz Palais within the streetscape. When you look up the sky, the diagonal placement of the dormers forms a new, exciting pattern on the roof, making a reference to the Baroque language of the facade and the composition of dormers and chimneys that used to be part of the original 18th century design. Within the passage, some of the original stucco fragments that were revealed when the 50s building was stripped back are being preserved. This might be the only moment today where a pastiche-like distinction between old and new is clearly tangible. These are photos from when we visited just before construction was completed in spring 2021, so last year, two years ago. In short, the design is not an historic restoration, really, but rather incorporates the historic front within a new building where the Palais has a coherent appearance within its new context. So the project I'm going to talk about next was a competition that the office won in 2014, so almost 10 years ago. It was for a new 15,000 square meter office building in central Hamburg. We started working on the design stage in 2016, and in 2018, a Hamburg-based developer called Built-in Real Estate took over after the initial client from the competition decided to drop out. We had many discussions with Hamburg City Council, excuse me, led by Franz Josef Höring, who took over from Jörn Walter in 2017, as we wanted to ensure the quality of the design. We finally went on site in 2019 with the assistance of a local executive architect. The site is located next to the Rathaus on the north and bordered by the St. Nikolai Church towards the south, of which today only the reconstructed church tower and spire remain. The main elevation of the site runs parallel to the Große Burster, a street that merges with the Bönkebergstraße and ends with the Hauptbahnhof on the north. On the top right corner of this aerial view, you also get a glimpse of the Speicherstadt, which is only a 5-minute walk away. Most of the surrounding buildings were destroyed during World War II and replaced, creating an interesting interplay of historic 70s and postmodern buildings. However, the overarching architectural character of the area goes back to the urban planning of the 19th century, with some early versions of the Kontorhäuser still in place. This historic map from 1590 shows that the site lies within the former city walls, and most importantly, its proximity to the Nikolai Fleet, which used to be one of the main canals in the Altstadt of Hamburg. Dating back to 1200, it is considered one of the oldest parts of the ports of Hamburg. The Fleet was the original branch of the Alster, which today forms 2 lakes in the city center, both prominent features in Hamburg's cityscape. This is the proposed site plan in which the new office building on Große Burster is part of a comprehensive master plan that restructures the urban block north of the St. Nikolai Church. The overarching master plan refers to the surrounding urban block as a grain and scale and reintroduces a mixed program of offices with retail on the ground floor and housing and a hotel. The site is divided into 5 plots that are developed by different architects. While the new buildings along the southern part of the project create a clear boundary to the square, the situation for the triangular site on top of this plan, that's the building we worked on, was more demanding and complex than the completion of the urban block on the south. So on the one hand, the new building needs to form a face towards the Große Burster. Excuse me. So on the one hand, the new building needs to form a face towards the Große Burster, an important urban street with a 19th century scale. On the other hand, the building faces the Nikolai fleet, forming the endpoint of an important visual axis towards the two bridges, called Trostbrücke and Sonnenbrücke. Here, the building appears in the context of historical buildings that border the fleet. In addition, the building is located in a special place where the Große Burster spans the canal, and the view from the street opens out over the water towards the south. At the second phase of post-war modernism in Germany, from the mid-1960s onwards, the city of Hamburg decided to further densify its inner city. For the area between the Große Burster and the Neue Burg, this meant that existing early 20th century buildings had to be demolished. These pictures show the Allianz skyscraper, that occupied the site before the newly proposed master plan of today. The construction of this skyscraper in 1970 represented a brutal intervention in the historic town and heavily diminished the 19th century urban plan of the city. As a consequence, the existing city layout was drastically changed, and the Bohnenstraße, whose original footprint goes back to the city fabric of the 15th century, was also abolished, serving back then as a delivery yard and car park entrance for the new office building. The new complex was divided into a low-rise building, which hardly fitted into the existing street lines, and a high-rise building which rose up as a solitaire with a total of 15 stories. The facade had all-around balconies with a cladding of anodized metal, which gave the building an abstract-looking horizontality and an amorphous building mass. It was decided about 10 years ago, before the competition that we worked on started, to demolish the building and to reinstate the street that connects San Nikolai, so the church on the south, and the main street called Große Burster. Other reasons for the demolition were the poor usability of the of the open plan, the depth of the floor plate, which made it impossible to meet current fire regulations, and the contamination of the facade with asbestos. Most importantly, though, the scale of the 70s building that you've just seen was inappropriate, and there was a lack of public space around and in between. The new master plan would re-establish a scale of city blocks more consistent with the surrounding fabric, as seen on this map from 1910, which illustrates the urban density that still defines Hamburg today. Some of the proposed buildings of the new master plan occupy the footprint of the former Allianz Tower. So the Allianz Tower here highlighted in yellow, it turned out possible to keep the existing underground car park and to position the new builds on top. The car park was gutted, but most of the outer shell of the existing retaining walls, in addition to the foundations and lower slab, were kept in place. Although the complexity during construction was immense due to the below-ground water pressure, the design team managed to reactivate as much of the below ground as possible. So the proposed building mass of our design for the corner building allows a better interlocking with the historical streets of the surrounding city, and further it increases the permeability of this inner city quarter. The facades of the new build are given the right proportion to address the range of different situations of the block. The form of the building creates distinct moments and views within the urban fabric. We have modified the massing at the head of the building, shaping a face instead of a rounded or pointy corner. This faceting gives the building a more vertical proportion that rises powerfully from the ground and allows for a stronger presence when viewed from the street. When looking along Große Burster, The corner forms an impressive figure in the street. The facades contribute to the richness and quality of urban space that characterizes this part of Hamburg's Altstadt. The head of the building accommodates the main entrance on the ground floor that connects to the upper floor offices. A second entrance and lobby along the street allows the desired flexibility for multiple tenants. The vertical figure is an idea that can be applied to the other corners of the triangular site, tying the building's irregular sides and conditions into a new whole. From the water side, a vertical face grows upwards from the public terrace on the canal, forming another strong figure at the center of this unusual scenery. This model here also shows our proposal, as I'm pointing out now, for the extension of the Globushof that would complete the block as an extension of that existing building and become part of the overall composition. As mentioned previously, we did not succeed in the competition, and it is unclear today how the gap will be filled. Along the terrace facing the Fleet, the canal, horizontal glazing on the ground floor creates an excellent space for a restaurant or a cafe. The widened terrace is an ideal place for outdoor seating in the summer and provides a sunny, sheltered spot away from the traffic noise. This outdoor corridor between the northern arcade and the Globushof connects to the Bohnenstraße on the south and enhances the network of spaces that used to characterize this part of the city. The building contributes to the public realm and enhances the relationship between urban space and the quality of life. The facades differentiate between the base, middle zone, and top of the building to bring the volume closer to the proportions of the surrounding buildings. Mineral facades in light color rise from a base designed in dark shades. The base zone of the building has two-story pillars with shopfront windows stretched between them on the ground floor. The top of the building is set back on the 7th floor and jumps back again on the 9th floor, giving the new building an expressive crown. The building has a total of 10 stories, of which the ground and first floor are combined to form the taller plinth. The cross-section here indicates the stepping back on the 7th and 9th floor towards the Großer Burster on the right, and shows the lower part of the courtyard that opens up towards the Fleet on the left-hand side of the drawing. On the ground floor, commercial and retail units are located between and around the office entrance course on all three sides. The two arcades are located on either end of the building along the Großer Burster, with the one on the north connecting the street to the waterfront. This drawing also shows how the water edge is reshaped along the terrace to create a more urban and general space here, as previously described. The organization of the floor plan creates excellent office space along the facades. The arrangement allows each floor to be flexibly subdivided to accommodate several tenants. The two lift courts allow separate access for up to 4 units per floor. The narrow depth of the wings and the generosity of the glazed facades create a throughout well-lit and healthy office environment. This drawing shows the second floor with a green roof in the center of the plan, which is accessible directly from the offices around. The regular floor plate, or typical plan, basically follows the organization as previously described, but on the 3rd floor, the massing of the building changes to open up the courtyards towards the canal. On the 7th and 8th floor, the facades step back slightly along the 2 main street elevations. On the 9th floor, the special plan shape of the facade and the higher floor to ceiling heights give the building a special crown at the top. This also creates further terraces with fantastic views over the city. So the town hall and the surrounding streets are mainly characterized by mineral facades in light tones, and stone is a material that was used a lot. The Börsenburg, built by Henry Grell, has a beige-white limestone facade that is typical for the inner city location. And the building on the opposite corner of the site, shown on the left-hand side of this slide, consists of glazed clinker bricks with some elements of the facade in white stucco. The character of this location is quite different from the Speicherstadt and the Kontohausviertel, where the dark brown engineered clinker from the north of Germany is a dominant facade material. As most of the surrounding facades around the site are masonry, we felt from the start of the project that a thin glass skin for the building would not be appropriate. The more significant aspect, however, is that there's a tradition of delicacy and richness of detail in the surfaces of these facades, a characteristic of many older buildings in the urban landscape. On the left is a historic photograph of the Gertig house that used to occupy the corner of the site. It was built in 1905, then demolished to make space excuse me, to make space for the 70s Allianz Tower. The vertical facades made out of glazed clinker brick seem to grow up along the streets and clearly define the streetscape. The photo on the right shows the current neighbor to the site, an early Konto house by Henry Gell with a limestone facade. So we have chosen terracotta as a facade material, light in color, which is very similar to the natural color of the local sandstone. Unlike the surrounding historic buildings with load-bearing facade construction, however, the facade material here is a cladding, and in keeping with its nature, is used as a lighter and more visually diverse envelope for the building. The terracotta facade was designed as a delicate envelope whose vertical texture follows the standardized 1.3 to 1.35 meter wide office grid. The terracotta elements are very fine vertical extrusions with a curved profile that cluster and plan around the load-bearing internal facade columns. The liveliness of the surface of the terracotta is important and is achieved by a slightly transparent glaze that is applied to a light clay mixture. The cladding system works with different facade elements that are joined to each other in different ways, creating variations in scale across the entire view and bringing out the different proportions of the facade. We made these one-to-one models to study the proportion and constellation, or let's say composition of the different convex and concave shapes that are being woven together. Due to the size of the project, only a very limited number of suppliers are available today to produce the required amount of facade elements. They all work with a highly industrialized manufacturing process, setting the parameters for size and finish. So the terracotta was produced by NBK, with whom we developed the light glaze and the bespoke steel dies to create the facade profiles. NBK used an extrusion kiln with a large conveyor belt where the ceramic travels through the oven and firing can be tightly controlled. In comparison to a standard box kiln, this process is less cost-effective and foremost requires less operational energy. Kilns at NBK are about 40 meters long, but they are limited in height, which defines the maximum size of the profiles of circa 140 millimeters. This would become a driving factor for the detailed design of the facade. These and the previous pictures are from our site visits when the building was under construction in summer last year. The corners, as seen in these detailed drawings, are composed of the same elements as the regular facade types, so that the number of dies could be reduced to a minimum. The 7-story facades along Große Burster and Bohnenstraße have a wider proportion. Here the emphasis is on the 2.6 meter wide facade division. The short elevations and the top floors of the building follow the finer 1.3 wide division. As the building rises to the sky, the windows are more vertical, which emphasizes the verticality of the whole facade. A close-up photo when standing on the scaffolding reveals the size of the vertical elements. The shape of the extrusions gives the facade a surprising depth, so that when you look at the facades from the street line, you see more ceramic elements than glazing. The unusual sharpness of the extrusions creates a subtle play of shadows. And another important aspect of the design is the regular system of joints of the ceramic elements, which create a pattern across the entire facade. The courtyard facade, as seen on the right-hand side image, follows the vertical structure of the primary facades, although simpler in design and materials. When we look close at the terracotta facade on the left, the continuous flashings at the top and convex window sills made out of laser-cut aluminium add to the complexity and richness of the facades. The terraces on the top floor offer a fantastic view over the city with the spire of the Rathaus City Hall at the northeast end of the building. On the ground floor, the base of the building is formed by a colonnade of dark prefabricated concrete columns in a wider spacing than the office grid of the upper floors. The double-story plinth is characterized by the sculptural quality of the pilasters, which frame the generous shopfront windows of the ground floor. The columns are not load-bearing, but follow the rhythm of the structural columns behind. The geometry was developed in a way that pilasters can be adjusted to their specific locations. Therefore, for example, the freestanding column of the arcade is assembled out of 4 elements from the basic module. On the left-hand side, you can see a mock-up that shows the monolithic appearance of the pilasters. The black aggregate will become visible by polishing the surface of the precast element. And for an even distribution of the aggregates, it is best to cast the elements horizontally, which was another reason to split the columns into several segments. The ground floor glazing is slightly kinked and bends away from the columns. There are several variants of the same facade bay, which are either designed as display windows or accommodate recessed doors that lead to the lobbies on the ground floor. To emphasize and distinguish the entrances, special colored circular tiles are mounted above the doors and onto the ceilings of the arcades at both ends of the main elevation. The round format allows the complex geometry of the ceiling surface to be evenly filled. So this is what the building looks like when we visited in December last year. You can see that most of the terracotta facade is finished, and the ground floor cladding has already been mounted along the Große Brüste on the left. And you can see also the curved Bohnenstraße on the right-hand side of this image and the Globushof at the back. You can also see that there's still a gap between our building and the Globushof, which means that construction for the extension, I'm pointing it out here, the extension for the existing building hasn't started yet. I want to apologize here quickly for the bad photography throughout the presentation. Both buildings, this and the Goetzpalais, will hopefully be photographed in spring this year. Looking towards the southwest, this image shows the building in relation to the neighbor on the left with its light sandstone facade, which was a reference for the materiality of our building. The weather in Hamburg can change very quickly. As we went around the corner the same day, the different light condition changed the appearance of the building and the color of the terracotta facade. This is the view from the Trostbrücke, where the vertical tower grows upwards from the canal to make a strong figure within this special location of the inner city of Hamburg. That's it.